WTOP presents Racial Relations, a preliminary report, a program based entirely on the findings of the President's Committee on Civil Rights. It has been prepared by the WTOP news staff and will include recorded comments from a number of Washington citizens, men qualified to answer criticism directed at their organizations by the President's Committee. Your narrator is WTOP Specialist in District Affairs, Henry Mustin.
This is Washington's own problem. It's something that we are expected to handle ourselves without much help from the outside. It's a big problem, and it can't be settled in a hurry. And it's complicated enough to let us hit only a few of the highlights now. So, we'll get on with it. About a month ago, on October 29th, the President's Committee on Civil Rights made its report and entitled it, "To Secure These Rights." That report was published in full with the blessings of the White House. The committee went to work nearly a year ago. They made it their job to find out where and to what extent the constitutional rights of American citizens are being violated. It's a distinguished committee and a well-rounded one. Even in this day, when labels are tossed around freely, you'd have to stretch things to call any member a communist or a fascist. There's the chairman, Charles E. Wilson, the president of the biggest electrical manufacturing company in the nation. The membership includes clergymen of three faiths, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. It includes 2 Negroes, and there are representatives of industry, education, labor, and a veterans organization. By now, you've heard something about their report, but we think not enough. In their report, these 15 committee members find some areas where conditions aren't too bad for the minority groups, but more places where they are, places where, unless there's improvement, American citizens will continue to live with less than the rights of free human beings. So much for what's happening to our minorities over the country, our Negroes, Orientals, Indians, our Jews. You don't have to read much of the report before you learn that in the committee's opinion, Washington, our city of Washington, D.C., has a special place of dishonor. The committee says of Washington,
"The nation's capital illustrates dramatically the shortcomings in our record and the need for change. The District of Columbia should symbolize to our own citizens and to the people of all countries our great tradition of civil liberty. Instead, it is a graphic illustration of a failure of democracy. This is the situation that exists in the District of Columbia. The committee feels most deeply that it is intolerable."
Those are harsh words, enough to make the average citizen blush. But maybe it's not all true. Perhaps the report is unfair. In presenting this program, we're not arguing either way, because we know only this much for certain, that it isn't a question of all good on one side and all bad on the other, and even the President's Committee couldn't agree on everything, and they worked on this for almost a year. But they did talk about it. They did investigate the problems. And so we think that Washington should be heard from. For that reason, we're going into the report point by point now, charge and countercharge, individual by individual, as long as our time allows. First, education. Here's what the President's Committee report says about our public schools.
The core of Washington's segregated society is its dual system of public education. Official freezing of the segregated school system is complete. Private universities in the district have followed the lead of the public schools.
There must be people in Washington who are willing to talk about this school situation, somebody in a position to know, to tell us how much of this is true and how much false. We asked the superintendent of schools, Dr. Hobart Corning, but he told us it's a matter of policy, something for the Board of Education to deal with. That would make the president of the board next, but she was out of town. So we talked about the report with the acting president, Dr. Robert Maurer. As was the case with everybody else, he agreed to talk only as an individual, not in any official capacity. The first question we put to him arose from this statement in the report, that segregation in the schools is due to congressional legislation, which assumes that whites shall be separated from Negro, but does not make it mandatory. Dr. Maurer put his answer this way.
The commissioners of the district and the Board of Education have power to provide for public schools only as Congress directs. Back in 1862, 1867, 1871, and 1873, acts of Congress may be cited which provide for colored schools organized under it's a sorry. When in 1874, I think it was, Congress set up a commission form of government for the District of Columbia, several commission orders during that year made specific reference to schools for colored children. I'm using those words in quotes. The Organic Act of 1906 for governing the public schools in the District of Columbia, which is now still in force, has as many as 23 specific provisions using the words white schools, colored schools, schools in which colored children are taught, colored teachers, white teachers, white assistant superintendents, colored assistant superintendents.
Dr. Moore cited many laws to refute the report's charge, and he ended this phase with a question of his own.
In the light of this background, can one reasonably conclude that Congress has not specifically provided for separate schools?
Next, a question of comparison. The report says categorically that Negro schools are inferior to white schools in almost every respect. Dr. Moore's answer began this way.
The distribution of textbook funds has been absolutely on a per capita basis. And the same is true of library books and classroom supplies. In laboratories and shops in the schools, distribution is on a pupil semester hour basis. And, as I have noted before, teachers' salaries are also equal.
Our final question was, Dr. Moore, do you, not as a member of the school board, but as a plain citizen, do you believe that segregation should be done away with?
Well, I think that is a matter that I would rather not comment on now. After all, as I pointed out in what I have said in answer to your question, we have a dual system here in Washington. It has its disadvantages. I think there's no doubt about that. But I also pointed out that the colored people in the district have the right to be proud of what they have done in building up maintaining their school system. I would rather just leave it to Congress to decide.
So much for the public schools. Among the many colleges in the Washington area, there are two that admit Negroes. So we chose American University, which takes them into its graduate school, but not as undergraduates, a sort of compromise. We asked the president, Dr. Paul F. Douglas, if there's been any friction between the races. He said,
Well, I think I should answer that by saying that a few years ago, a church in Washington made a request that we exclude Negroes from our School of Social Sciences and Public Affairs, and we reconsidered the whole problem. We have taken very careful studies about the relationships of the Negroes to the white students. Occasionally some person who has a prejudice makes a comment, but we have never observed any difficulty in their behavior, in the relationships, and as far as we're concerned, our faculty and students take the relationship as a normal American pattern. The Board of Trustees has considered the problem very carefully and has taken the general position that there's nothing which permits a student to enter an institution except the quality of his mind, and that the problem is left to each faculty of the university as far as the admission of students is concerned.
Next to be dealt with in the President's Committee report was discrimination in housing. The report gives this dismal picture.
Negroes are increasingly being forced into a few overcrowded slums. Programs for the development of highways, parks, and public buildings have often played an unfortunate role in rooting out Negro neighborhoods. But there has been little concern for the fate of persons displaced by beautification projects. The all-white Washington Real Estate Board has a code of ethics which prohibits its members from selling land in predominantly white areas to Negroes. And because the policy of the National Capital Housing Authority is to follow the community pattern, all public housing projects are completely segregated.
Here, we thought, were questions with built-in answers, statements naming groups that would want to talk about it. But here also we ran into difficulties. Many people told us that in their opinion the best thing is not to talk about racial questions. People like the president of the Real Estate Board, F. Moran McConaughey, and the head of the National Capital Housing Authority, John Ilder. They refused to join in this program. Even in the face of criticism which has the approval of the White House, they have nothing to say. One man would talk about it, the past president of the Federation of Citizens Associations, Clifford A. Newell. He couldn't answer all of the questions, but he was familiar with one aspect of discrimination in housing, the restrictive covenant, something the report calls the chief weapon in the effort to keep Negroes from moving out of overcrowded quarters into white neighborhoods. Here, Mr. Newell defends the covenant.
My belief in covenants rests entirely upon the right of individuals to guarantee contentment and happiness to their own families and to protect their investments. I believe that's the foundation for all covenants. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are covenants just against the colored people. I know of many colored people that I would object to living in my block. But that does not mean that it carries with it the thought of bringing people in there who would not be satisfactory neighbors. And that applies to some white people the same as colored people.
Well, have you, Mr. Newell, any knowledge at hand of the legality of a covenant? I believe you're a lawyer.
I am, yes. I'm not
how do you
practicing
feel-
law here.
You're not practicing here, I know, but with as a man with a legal background, how do you think that a covenant would fare in a court of law?
The covenants, so far as I'm acquainted with their cases in court, have been decided in all instances in favor of the covenant, provided they are not extended for more than 21 years. That seemingly is good law, because certainly any individual ought to have a right to contract with his neighbors for something over a period of time in which he is presumed to live in that locality. But for it to be made perpetual, I am in agreement with many other people in saying that I believe that would be against public policy, because no one has a right to restrict any property that he may own for a longer period than he is presumed to be the occupant of that property himself. And the law understands that to be 21 years.
Mr. Newell told us, among other things, that nearly 50% of Washington's residential areas are covenanted to exclude Negroes, that he himself lives in a covenanted neighborhood. We raised the question of Georgetown, a fashionable quarter of the city, and yet a place where white and Negro live side by side in apparent harmony. He said this.
I would answer it in this way. As I said before, I do not think a covenant necessarily applies to any race or creed. I think it applies and should apply to a desirable class of people residing in that community. Now, in stating it in that way, I again reiterate that there are plenty of very fine Negro families here in Washington, and we have absolutely nothing at all against those people. The mistake that they're making and that their friends are making is in the fact that they want to extend their privileges and their good fellowship toward us whites by including all of the people of their race. And I feel deeply that they have a responsibility to uplift that segment of the colored people that have not gone forward as far in civic responsibilities as these colored people that I have mentioned. I feel that they can serve their own race much better by being with their race than by deserting those unfortunate people of their race in going into white areas when they know that these other people of their race can't follow them.
That brings us to the question of discrimination in health services. Of this, the report says,
The greatest inequalities are evident in Washington's concern for the health of its residents. 4 of the 12 private hospitals do not admit Negro inpatients, and the rest accept only a few in segregated wards. Far fewer hospital beds in proportion to population are available to Negroes than to whites. No Negro physician is allowed to practice in Gallinger Hospital, although it is publicly supported and the majority of its patients are colored.
On this subject, first we tried to question the president of the District Medical Society, Dr. Raymond Holden, but his board of directors advised him against any comment. Then the city health officer, Dr. George C. Ruland, the man responsible for Gallinger Hospital. But no, Dr. Ruland explained that in effect he was gagged. That, and I quote him, I was advised not to talk, that it might lead to complications. Finally, he agreed to do whatever his superior, Commissioner Guy Mason, recommended. Mason's advice was, and I quote again, I strongly advised against any comment. It might lead to complications. So, no comment at all on discrimination in health services. Next, discrimination in employment, of which the President's Committee report says,
Negroes are confined to the lowest paid and least skilled jobs in private employment. In 1940, 3/4 of all Negro workers in Washington were domestics, service workers, or laborers, while only 1/8 of the white workers hold jobs of that type.
We thought the man to confirm or deny this would be the director of the U.S. Employment Service here, Fred Hetzel. We asked him for a specific answer to the charges.
Well, that's difficult to answer, too, because so many thousands of jobs, as I said in the beginning, go through the personnel departments of the private employers. However, I could point this out. You mentioned specifically clerical jobs. For the past 12 months, the same months I mentioned a moment ago, we referred 5,674 white applicants to clerical jobs here in the District of Columbia, and those applicants were hired. During the same period of time, we found jobs for only 1,540 Negro applicants in that particular classification, job classification. In the so-called service group, which means roughly hotels, restaurants, laundries, and that type of work, we found jobs for around 1,681 white applicants, whereas in that same classification, we placed 14,762 Negro applicants. Still another classification that may be of interest is what we call skilled workers. That means carpenters, bricklayers, pattern makers, cooks, anything else that may be of a strictly skilled category. Now, in that group, we placed 1,121 white applicants and 560 non-white or Negro applicants. So roughly the percentage there was about 2-to-1. In the unskilled group, we placed a total of 5,775 white and colored. The breakdown there was 935 white and 4,840 Negro. So the percentage all the way through is fairly consistent. I think we could summarize the entire situation by saying that insofar as the Employment Service is concerned, about 2/3 of all of our applicants are Negro, and about 2/3 of all of our placements are Negro.
So we asked Mr. Hetzel what, in a few words, this array of statistics means to people, white and Negro, who are trying to get jobs.
Well, I think that the figures are entirely inconclusive on that particular point for the reason that I mentioned in the very beginning, that so many employers don't place all of their jobs with the Employment Service. But so far as our orders themselves are concerned, the number of job orders that are placed with the Employment Service, it would appear that the figures which I mentioned just a moment ago bear out the fact that possibly the percentage is in favor of the white applicants insofar as the desirability of jobs is concerned.
Public accommodation was next, places where people rub elbows in the normal course of their daily lives. Here are some of the things the report says on this subject.
No downtown theater, except the Burlesque House, admits Negroes. They may see movies only in their own neighborhood houses. Although they may dine at Union Station, the YWCA, and the cafeterias in government office buildings, the overwhelming majority of downtown restaurants are closed to them.
We asked two people to talk about discrimination in these places, the president of the Theater Owners and Managers Association, Julian Berlowski, and the secretary of the Restaurant Association, Robert Wilson. Both turned us down. The less said about it, the better, was their attitude. This is nothing to talk about. And that brought us finally to the question of discrimination in recreation. We discussed it with the chairman of the Recreation Board, Harry Wender. First, he wanted to talk about the report as a whole. He thought it unfair and in itself a violation of civil liberties.
I have an inherent abhorrence for segregation and all of its connotations. As a member of a minority people myself, I value and hold dear those wonderful things that have been made available to me as an American citizen. And yet I recognize that there are people who are members of my faith who have been denied civil rights in this country and are being denied those rights today. And I fully recognize the many injustices that are visited daily upon the Negro people of this country. But despite that fact, it does not mean, I want to insist, that any committee has the right to investigate anything so precious as these civil liberties, which are ours under our form of government, under the Constitution of the United States, without fully recognizing that they should practice what they preach.
And then the questions. The first, what about the report's statement that compulsory segregation has increased over the past 25 years?
I want to say that, in my opinion, that first sentence of the statement on recreation in the district is absolutely untrue. It is difficult for me in the short time which we have here to prove that. But of course the committee has presented no facts whatever to support such a blanket indictment of the District of Columbia. It just isn't true, and I could devote a half-hour broadcast to proving it. Now, we haven't time for that. But just let me categorically deny it, and that I know it of my personal knowledge, and particularly within the past 5 years, I can demonstrate conclusively that there are far fewer segregated areas on the whole than there were when the board came into being.
Next, has the Recreation Board gone against the wishes of Congress? Has it ignored the law by enforcing segregation in the parks and playgrounds?
Well, Henry, this again is one of those blanket questions that would require actually several hours to give a complete answer to. The truth of the matter is that the committee has presented a half-truth here, coupled with statements that are not true at all. Now, it is true that the original bill that was presented to Congress for the creation of a recreation board did contain specific language which would have made it compulsory in every particular that we have a segregated recreation system in Washington.
And Mr. Wender had more to say on the same subject.
Now, what I say here is not in justification of that policy. The fact is that that plan was in existence. And the sponsors of the bill knew that if there were any deviation from that, the bill could never pass, and there could never be a consolidation, a unification of our recreation program. And so it was included. And we have followed that plan with the full knowledge that it was thoroughly and completely legal and compulsory upon the board. Furthermore, with the approval of the Civil Service Commission, a dual setup in our department staff was created. On the one hand, we have an assistant superintendent in charge of the white division with white employees, and on the other, an assistant superintendent who is a Negro in charge of the Negro setup with an entire staff of Negro recreation leaders.
Because Negro recreation areas are concentrated in the older, crowded parts of the city, the report says, white facilities are generally superior. But Mr. Wender disagrees.
I will say to you that we have spent more of the taxpayers' dollar proportionately for Negroes than we have for whites. Those playgrounds that we have erected for them are comparable in every respect. Our future program, and I happen to be looking at this very moment in my office, at the first section of the Deferred Development Program with the plan requirements of our board, land improvements and plans for development throughout the District of Columbia. If you were to take the time to look over that great number of projects which we propose, you will find that in every Negro area in Washington, we have proposed fine, new, excellent play facilities.
Another charge in the report is that recreation areas run by the Interior Department are not segregated, and district officials have tried repeatedly to get control of these areas, but that the transfer has not been made because the Recreation Board will not agree to end segregation. Mr. Wender said,
"It is generally true that under the Park Service, segregation is not permitted. However, the committee failed to consider one important aspect of that problem. They failed to mention that the swimming pools, located in some instances on parkland, are segregated today and always have been. And by the way, they're also segregated in many of the communities of the United States where there is no segregation in other respects. And I cite Cincinnati, the home of the abolitionists, where there has been no segregation of any kind since the Civil War, except in swimming pools, where there is a strict policy of segregation observed.
in conclusion, let us quote once more from a document, this one, the Constitution of the United States.
All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
For the last half hour, we have tried to bring you part of the story of racial relations in Washington, but only part. We hope that it's a good start. We hope that at some other time, other people will be willing to put themselves on the record on this subject. That possibly some of those who won't discuss it now will want to have their say at some later time. As reporters, we try to give you the continuing story of Washington, and this, the problem of racial relations, is essential to that story.
You've been listening to Racial Relations, a preliminary report. Henry Mustin of the WTOP news staff was the narrator. This program, which included recordings, was produced by Larry Beckerman. George Connery supervised the preparation and writing. This has been a news presentation of WTOP in Washington.